All right, guys, welcome to American Lit 1. This is going to be the first of our video updates we're going to do each week toward the end of the week to sort of prepare you for the next week's reading, to kind of wrap up where we've been, where we're going. A couple things just real quick. I sent out an email earlier today, but I want to stress I think Troy Online is sending blanket emails to everybody that's enrolled in T5 about signing up for the proctor, but we are not having a proctored exam in American Lit 1, so just ignore that email. Okay, so where are we in the class? Week 1 was our introduction to Puritanism. And what I would like you to be able to do with that is to have a basic understanding of the 5 basic Puritan beliefs that are outlined for you and the type of literature that Puritans would have written. Most importantly, Puritans did not believe in fiction. Fiction was corrupt because it was made up, it was invented. Um, the types of literature that most predominated in the Puritan era would have been sermons and then sort of testimonials, autobiographies, personal narratives that testified to God's grace. So as we move forward, what we've been talking about is I would start with Bradford, make sure you can see in there the Puritan mindset, how everything is a revelation of God's divine grace. One thing that didn't come up a lot in the first discussion questions that I want to reemphasize is the notion that Puritans believed in typological history. And what that simply means is history is not what's happening at the moment, it's not what happened in the past, it is what will happen in the future. The future has already been told in the Bible. So everything that is happening, if I were a Puritan, everything that is happening in my here and now, I understand it through the Bible as a revelation of God's divine grace. That immediately creates some issues for Puritans because not everything can be reconciled through biblical interpretation, especially when your culture is telling you you have to interpret the Bible literally. Let me give you an example of what I mean by literal interpretation of the Bible. So last week in Texas, there was a huge controversy where a state assemblyman, I think it was Texas, I can't remember, but a state rep um, basically came out and said that he would not be able to allow women to give the opening prayer at a state house event because in the Bible there was a certain verse that said women should not be allowed to pray in public. I think for most of us, we would probably say, okay, that's a kind of historical thing. We've outgrown that. But this guy basically argued that because it was in the Bible, he couldn't do it. That's an example of a literal interpretation. So as we move forward from week 1 to week 2, now we saw with the Thomas Morton how the Puritans were ridiculed for their vision of the world as a revelation of God's divine grace. Guys like Morton came to the New World strictly for the commercialism, strictly for the colonial exploitation of the land and of the profit that it posed. For the Puritans, the difficulty of living an entirely religious life started off almost immediately. And look at that Bradford chapter about how prosperity brings about a fall of religious nobility. People started getting money, people started getting surplus, the societies became more commercial than religious, and right away you have a sort of conflict between the secular and the spiritual. One of the things that happens in the lesson 2 is you immediately have this conflict in terms of being able to interpret the entire world around us as theological with the Salem witch trials. We have these signs around us. How do I know if you sprout a little birthmark on your head that that's truly a mark of the devil, that you've truly been bewitched? Well, I have to go to the Bible and find evidence of it. So there's social crises, whether it's slavery, whether it's accusations of witchcraft, that the Puritans struggled to figure out whether they're accurate interpretations of the Bible or not. And it all comes down to the struggle to interpret. Um, that's really what happened to the Puritan communities. So lesson 2 is really about the crises in Puritanism and how they're both tied to interpreting the world and the Bible literally to find those revelations of God's grace. This week, as we talk about Mary Rowlandson, I've given you specific strategies in the lessons that tell you how to see in there the way that she would use the Bible, literally use the Bible, physically use the Bible at the moments of crisis. And there's events where, things that happen and she'll say, well, as, blah, 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 this book of the Bible says. That's a perfect example, I think, of how the Puritans used Scripture in moments of crisis to understand the world around her. The challenge of that captivity narrative, and that's a genre that you're going to want to be able to find, is that the accounts immediately became sensationalized. So on the one hand, you have these bloody scenes of the Native Americans hatcheting people, and yet you turn around and you find the spiritual elements of the text. Those things are in conflict as Rowlandson is writing. So just keep in mind those basic challenges of Puritanism. And we're going to find by the time we get to Jonathan Edwards that we're gradually rolling out of the basic Puritan prejudice against emotion, to where Edwards basically reinvents Puritanism to encompass feeling as opposed to reason, interpreting the Bible reasonably. And as you read his autobiography, his personal narrative, I want you to see how often he refers to the beauty or the joy of God's grace. And that's a very difficult thing to sort of wrap your mind around with Puritanism, because it's a very deterministic or a very negative sort of theology. I mean, the basic idea is we don't know if we're going to go to hell. We can't earn grace. And there's a lot of psychological stress that comes with that, about how do we function ethically when without the opportunity to earn grace, as most Christian variations of Christianity would allow us to do. By the time we get to Benjamin Franklin, the important thing is this whole idea of living the good life according to Puritans becomes entirely secularized. It becomes a way of succeeding in the business world and becoming an ethical business or public person. So with Franklin, you see all of these sort of challenges he has through his life where he admits to failing, and he defines his whole life as a book full of printer errors. But you get to that final section there where he's talking about the virtues, or the way we self-regulate our virtues. And again, it goes back to Puritanism with the idea that we are all responsible for analyzing our actions and our behaviors on a daily basis to see if we meet our obligations to be a good person. The difference again is it's entirely secular in the business world, right down to, don't eat too much, don't drink too much, read to advance your mind, that kind of thing. All right, so that's kind of where we are in these first 4 lessons that we've done in week 1 and week 2. We start out with the Puritans. We're looking at the way the what's often called the Puritan inheritance, gets secularized by the late 18th century with Benjamin Franklin. In terms of some of the issues that have come up in our first 2 discussion questions, which I've now posted comments for, the main thing I want to emphasize is many of you have probably been taught in like English 1101, 1102, that the thesis statement comes at the end of the first paragraph. I do that a little differently because what I don't want you to do is start broad and work your way toward the thesis. What I want you to do is pop that thesis statement into the very first sentence. And I'm encouraging you to think of the function of this particular topic or this particular device. The function of X in Puritan literature is Y, because I really want to emphasize the idea that in our discussion questions, we're working on a argumentative purpose. We have a goal or something we are proving in our analysis that, and we need that so we can structure our post accordingly. You should have multiple paragraphs. You should have an introduction, statement, a little bit of background, then you prove it by analyzing your examples. That's the body of your post. Doesn't have to be more than 1 or 2 paragraphs, but all your paragraphs should be about 7 sentences. Then wrap it up with a conclusion. Okay. Overall, I'm not seeing a whole lot of grammar issues. For those of you that I am marking grammar stuff, I encourage you off the Troy website to download Grammarly. You do want to be able to get down basic ideas that the difference between a plural and a possessive, plural possessive and a singular possessive. That's very important in the case of, for example, talking about the Puritans rather than one Puritan. Other grammar issues that are popping up or other rhetorical issues. No second person in your business writing. No second Puritan. No second person in your professional writing. You is too colloquial, too informal. You can use one, but really what we want you to do is not reference the reader at all, but focus on the text. You don't need a line like, when reading these stories, X happens. Just say X happens. So as you work, what I'd like everybody to do is, before you start discussion 3, is to make up a list of the advice that I give you. And I really want to see in discussion questions 3 and 4, you applying my advice to this week's discussion questions. That's what your score for the first 5 discussion questions is going to be. How well you improve according to the advice that I give you. All right, if you have any questions about your comments, about what you should be doing in DQ 3 and 4, just let me know. I'll be happy to explain further in email or in the discussion questions posts. Other than that, I hope you're enjoying the readings. I know it's a lot, but I also know that the concepts are pretty straightforward. Just, again, read the lessons first, so you know what to look for when you read the readings in the book. All right, we'll see you online, I'm sure, all weekend, and we'll have another video update in Module 3, probably about Wednesday or Thursday of next week. Thanks. Bye-bye.